June 18, 1944. The volcanic black sand of Saipan in the Mariana Islands 11 days into the American invasion, the air thick with cordite and the particular smell of a tropical island being systematically destroyed by naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The temperature sits at 94 degrees, and the humidity makes every piece of equipment feel like it weighs twice what it actually does. Marine Corps communications networks across the island have been compromised for the past 6 hours. Japanese signal intelligence units have broken into at least 2 tactical radio frequencies, and Division Command has gone dark on standard voice traffic, switching every forward unit over to a transmission method that has, in 11 days of combat across this island, never once been intercepted, decoded, or even correctly identified by the Imperial Japanese Army's otherwise highly capable signals intelligence service. The method is 2 Marines sitting in a foxhole 40 meters behind the front line, one of them speaking rapidly into a field radio handset in a language that does not exist on any cryptographic chart in Tokyo, Berlin, or anywhere else on Earth, because it was never written down at all until the United States Marine Corps decided to weaponize it. A young corporal from a rifle company is lying wounded 800 meters forward. Of that foxhole, his leg shattered by mortar fragment. His unit pinned by Japanese machine gun fire from a coral ridge, and the artillery support that is about to save his life is being called in through a transmission he would have called 4 days earlier in front of several other men, gibberish, and called the man speaking it something considerably worse than that. Private First Class Carl Gorman was 35 years old, considerably older than Moses when he served alongside, a Navajo Marine from the community of Chinle, Arizona, on the eastern edge of the Navajo Nation in the high desert country below the Chusca Mountains. He had grown up herding sheep with his grandfather, speaking Navajo as his first language in a household where English arrived later, and remained secondary for most of his childhood, in the specific rhythm of reservation life in the 1920s that revolved around the seasons, the flocks, and the ceremonial calendar that governed when things were done and how. He had been sent, like many Navajo children of his generation, to a government-run boarding school where the explicit policy of the institutions was to eliminate Navajo language and culture from the students under its care, a policy enforced at his particular school, with mouth-washing punishments for children caught speaking their own language on the school grounds. Carl Gorman did not forget the language his teachers punished him for speaking. He carried it deliberately through the rest of his childhood and into adulthood, in the specific quiet defiance of someone who has decided that a thing taken from him by force is a thing he intends to keep regardless. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1942 at the age of 32, lying about his age to qualify, one of the first 29 Navajo recruits selected for a classified program that the Marine Corps would not fully explain to him or to any of the other recruits until they arrived at Camp Pendleton and were told the actual nature of the assignment. The program, conceived by a civil engineer named Philip Johnston, who had grown up on the Navajo reservation as the son of missionaries, and who understood both the language's complexity and its complete absence from any existing linguistic record accessible to enemy cryptographers. The key required these 29 men to develop, from nothing, a complete military code using their own language as its foundation, inventing Navajo terms for airplane types, ship classifications, military ranks, geographic features, and tactical concepts that had no existing equivalent in a language built around sheep, weather, ceremony, and the high desert landscape of the American Southwest. They built that code in 13 weeks. It contained over 400 terms and a complete phonetic alphabet, and every one of the original 29 men was required to memorize the entire system without ever writing it down, because the code's security depended entirely on the fact that it existed only in the minds of men who had built it together. By June 1944, Carl Gorman had transmitted and received thousands of messages across 2 previous campaigns. He had never made an error. No Navajo Code Talker across the entire war ever did. Second Lieutenant Walter Hendricks was 26 years old, a platoon leader from Macon, Georgia, who had joined the Marine Reserve in 1940 and been activated and commissioned after Pearl Harbor. He was a capable officer by most measures available to his superiors. He led his platoon competently in the assault landings on Saipan, and his men generally regarded him as fair and reasonably attentive to their welfare, which made what happened 4 days before the events on the Coral Ridge somewhat more complicated than a simple story about a bad man learning a lesson. Because Hendricks was not, in most respects, a bad officer. He had simply never encountered anything in his life in rural Georgia or at officer candidate school that had prepared him to make sense of a Navajo Marine, and he had filled the gap in his understanding with the only material available to him, which was a collection of assumptions about Native Americans absorbed from Western films, schoolyard talk, and the general cultural texture of the American South and Southwest in the 1930s and 1940s, assumptions that he had never ranged from the patronizing to the opening to examined, because the opportunity to be wrong about them in a consequential way had simply never arisen before. 4 days before the events on the Coral Ridge, during a rest period behind the lines, Hendricks had watched Carl Gorman and another Navajo Marine working through a transmission drill, speaking rapidly back and forth in Navajo, and had said to several men standing nearby, including 2 members of his own platoon, that the whole arrangement seemed like the Marine Corps keeping a couple of mascots around for the novelty of it, and that he personally doubted the gibberish they were speaking amounted to anything more sophisticated than what it sounded like. He had said this loudly enough that Carl Gorman heard it from 20 feet away. Gorman had not responded. He had continued the transmission drill without breaking his rhythm, which the men who witnessed it would later describe in interviews recorded decades afterward by military historians documenting the Code Talker program as the single most controlled and dignified response to an insult that any of them had personally witnessed during the entire war. By the summer of 1944, the value of the Navajo Code Talker program had been demonstrated repeatedly across the Pacific Theater, though its existence remained formally classified and would not be publicly acknowledged by the United States government until 1968, meaning that the men who built and operated the most secure tactical communications system used by any combatant force in the Second World War received no public recognition for it during their lifetimes, in most cases, and operated for the entire war inside a Marine Corps and a country that frequently treated them, in the day-to-day texture of military life, with exactly the kind of casual contempt that Hendricks had displayed. The code's effectiveness rested specifically on the fact that Navajo, unlike European languages, had no written form accessible to any cryptographic analysis until missionaries and government linguists began documenting it in the early 20th century, and even those limited written records bore no resemblance to the operational battlefield code the Marines had constructed, which used substitution terms and an invented phonetic alphabet layered on top of an already obscure language. Japanese signals intelligence, among the most capable in the world at breaking conventional military codes, never broke a single message transmitted by a Navajo Code Talker throughout the entire war, a fact later confirmed by captured Japanese cryptographic personnel after the war's end, several of whom stated under interrogation that they had assumed the transmissions were a form of tribal ceremonial chanting unrelated to military operations. On the morning of June 18th, the rifle company that included Lieutenant Hendricks's platoon advanced against a fortified Japanese position on a coral ridge and was pinned down by interlocking machine gun fire within the first 10 minutes of the assault. A corporal in Hendricks's own platoon took mortar fragment wounds to the leg severe enough that the company's medic, working under fire, assessed that the man would lose the leg or possibly his life without immediate evacuation and artillery suppression of the Japanese position covering the route out. Hendricks, pinned with the rest of his platoon behind a low coral outcropping, radioed back to the company command post, requesting immediate artillery fire on the ridge's forward slope, giving the coordinates as accurately as he could under fire. The request went out over standard voice channels. It was acknowledged. The artillery did not come because Division had pulled standard voice traffic off the air entire 40 minutes earlier. In response to confirmed Japanese signal intercepts on at least 2 frequencies, a change in procedure that had been communicated to company commanders but had not yet fully filtered down to every platoon leader pinned under fire on a forward slope. Hendrix's request sat in a communications gap for 6 minutes before the company commander, realizing the standard channel transmission had not been relayed, grabbed his radio operator and told him to get it to the code talker net immediately. Carl Gorman, 40 meters back in a communications foxhole, received the relayed coordinates and transmitted the fire mission in Navajo to the artillery battalion's code talker receiving station in under 90 seconds. The artillery battalion, working entirely through the code net, had the fire mission processed, verified, and rounds on the target within 4 minutes of receiving Gorman's transmission. The Japanese machine gun position covering the wounded corporal's evacuation route was suppressed. The corporal was carried out under the covering fire and reached the battalion aid station alive. He kept the leg, Hendrix learned, sometime over the following hour, as the details of the action were reconstructed by his company commander for the after-action report, and that the artillery fire, which had saved one of his own men's life, had been called in through the exact transmission method he had described 4 days earlier. In front of witnesses, as gibberish and mascot novelty, he did not say anything about this immediately. He sought out Carl Gorman that evening, after the position had been secured and the company had consolidated for the night. Finding him in the same communications foxhole, the men who were present, interviewed decades later for the Marine Corps' own oral history documentation of the Code Talker program, gave slightly varying accounts of the precise wording, but the substance was consistent across every version. Hendrix said that he understood the gibberish, as he had called it 4 days earlier, had moved an artillery fire mission from his radio to impact on target in under 40 minutes and had saved Corporal Whitfield's leg and very possibly his life. He said he had been wrong about what he had said and that he knew he had been wrong before this afternoon even happened, but that he was the kind of man who needed to see a thing rather than simply be told it, and that he had now seen it. He asked Gorman what the actual term was in Navajo for the artillery piece that had just fired. Gorman told him. Hendrix asked what it meant literally. Gorman said it translated, roughly, to a phrase referring to a specific type of large gun used in tribal ceremony for signalling across long distances, repurposed by the code's builders because the concept of long-range signalling already existed in the language and only needed to be attached to a new object. Hendrix listened to this. Then he asked Gorman if he would be willing to teach him a handful of basic code terms over the following weeks. Not because he expected to ever transmit them himself, but because he had decided that a man under his command, whose work he did not understand, was a problem he intended to fix personally, and that understanding began with learning the words. Gorman agreed. He spent roughly 20 minutes of most evenings for the remainder of 20 minutes for the remainder of the Saipan campaign, teaching Lieutenant Hendrix the basic vocabulary of a code that the lieutenant would never be permitted to use operationally and would be required, under the program's security protocols, to forget entirely once the war ended and the classification lifted enough for him to understand how completely he was never supposed to have learned it in the first place. Carl Gorman fought through the remainder of the Saipan campaign and the subsequent Marine campaigns in the Pacific, transmitting thousands of additional messages without a single recorded transmission error across the entirety of his service. He was discharged in 1945 and returned to the Navajo Nation, where for years he could not discuss what he had done during the war because the program remained classified and the discharge papers of the Code Talkers gave no indication of the nature of their specific contribution. He became, in the post-war decades, after the program's declassification in 1968, both a respected elder and an artist, studying painting later in life and becoming one of the founding faculty members of the Institute of American Indian Arts. He spoke about the war publicly in his later years including testimony to congressional committees regarding recognition for the Code Talkers, and was present in 2001 when President George W. Bush presented congressional gold medals to the surviving original 29 Code Talkers and posthumously to those who had died, an event Gorman attended at the age of 92. He died in 1998, 3 years before that ceremony took place, having spent the final decades of his life ensuring that the story would be told, even though he would not live to see the medal himself. The medal was received on his behalf by his family. His son, the painter R.C. Gorman, became one of the most recognized Native American artists of the 20th century and frequently credited his father's war artistic experience as the foundation of his own understanding of what it meant to carry something forward that other people had tried to take away. Walter Hendricks survived the war and was discharged in 1946. He returned to Macon, Georgia, and worked for 30 years as an insurance adjuster. He gave one recorded interview in 1992 to a regional Georgia Historical Society conducting oral histories of Pacific Theater veterans, in which he described the Saipan action and his conversation that evening with Gorman in considerable detail, stating that it remained the single experience of the war that he thought about more than any other, more than any combat action he had personally been part of, because it was the moment he understood that the things he had assumed his entire life, without ever once checking them against reality, could simply be wrong, completely and specifically wrong, in ways that had nearly cost one of his own men his leg through a communications failure that the men he had mocked were the ones who fixed. He died in 1999. Some historians of the Code Talker program have argued that incidents like the one between Hendricks and Gorman were far more common than the relatively small number of document accounts suggest, given that the Code Talkers served scattered individually or in small pairs across hundreds of Marine units throughout the Pacific Theater, each of them absorbing some version of the same unfamiliarity and casual prejudice from officers and fellow Marines who had simply never encountered a Navajo serviceman before and filled the gap with assumption rather than curiosity. Unfortunately, they argue that the program's effectiveness, fully appreciated only decades after the fact, once declassification allowed proper historical assessment, stands as one of the clearest examples in American military history of a marginalized group's specific cultural inheritance. In this case, a language that government boarding schools had spent decades trying violently to erase, becoming the decisive operational advantage that saved an unknowable number of American lives across the Pacific War. Others have focused on the bitter irony embedded in the story itself, noting that the same United States government that operated the assimilation boarding school system Carl Gorman survived as a child. Elagabalus didn't just want to act like a woman. Punishing him specifically for speaking depended on for its most secure communications network never formally reckoned with that contradiction in any sustained way, and that the post-war silence imposed by classification compounded an older silence that Navajo children had already been forced into for generations. What is certain is that on the evening of June 18, 1944, an officer who 4 days earlier had called a man's life's work gibberish sat in a foxhole and asked that man to teach him the words, and the man taught him, because teaching had always been the thing taken from him that he had decided, a long time before any of this, he intended to keep giving away on his own terms. If you had been Carl Gorman standing in that foxhole when Hendricks walked up that evening, what would you have said to him first? Leave your answers in the comments, and if you believe the men who fought this war in a language their own country once tried to beat out of them deserve to be remembered by name, subscribe, because most of their names are still not the ones history tends to teach.